Thank you very much for asking me to be part of this discussion. Most of it has already been, in some sense, said by Mr. Pai, which in some sense is a very comprehensive discussion of almost every part of it. I'll repeat some of those points, but also add to those points my own position on this, because this is not something which one can talk about without any controversies and differences, because those grounds have already been laid. And I think the question of binaries becomes very critical, and we need to engage with these issues because these are issues that concern all of us. We're obviously talking about reservations in context of the recent judgment of the Supreme Court. I have read the judgment. There are many judgments, and I'll come to that in a short while. And it's been a while, and lot has already been spoken and written on this judgment. As Mr. Pai was saying, most of it has been, in some sense, done by Dalit activists themselves, and there's now a very large articulate section of Dalit middle class, Dalit academics, Dalit activists who have spoken out, and they have spoken out in some sense very clearly. And what we hear from media reports as well as from these kinds of discussions is that by and large, Dalit voice seems to be against the judgment. So that also in some sense reflects the nature of the problem, right? Who speaks on whose behalf and what voices get articulated. My own position is not that of an activist. I'm otherwise, by temperament, I'm neither an activist nor am I a Dalit. So I don't have those kinds of stakes in the reservation policy. But I think there is a larger concern that all of us have at some level, since it is being organized by students of social sciences, as students of social sciences, as students of sociology and political science. We have professional, in some sense, interest in a subject like this. We need to be aware of what is happening in India and what implications would it have. But I think as citizens of this country also, this in some sense opens up many questions that we have taken for granted, or the manner in which they are being articulated by Dalit activists. I'm not saying there is anything wrong with that or there is any problem with that, but I think that's a position, and we should look at it as a position rather than as a judgment over the judgment. Or even judgment is also not free of politics, and politics is not something that's a bad thing. Politics is a very good thing in some sense. So my position is partly a kind of professional engagement with the question of caste, reservation, and question of marginalities, but also my position as a citizen of India. How should we look at the question of reservations? So, what is at stake when we think about this judgment? And I think I completely agree with most of the writing that has been done by activists, that what is at stake is the question of social justice. Reservations were a point for social justice, and as Professor Pai was talking about, there is a context, and the context is the Indian Constitution on the one side, and the fact that India is a society which is extremely hierarchical, divided, discriminated, and those divisions, hierarchical divisions based on caste, continue to persist. So on the one hand, we have a constitution, as Ambedkar had said when he presented the constitution to Constitutional Assembly, the big contradiction which India enters in 1950s. On the one hand, you have a constitution which is a liberal constitution which grants equality to every individual, and I'm underlying the word individual, as a person. And at the same time, we have a society which is structured around ascriptive identities, and those identities are not simply identities of collective groupings. Those identities are also hierarchical, and those hierarchies are at some level against the very idea of democracy. They at some level inhibit the possibility of individuals being citizens, being part of a nation which is modern in character. Uh, So, if one was to kind of take, broadly speaking, an Ambedkarite perspective, or what in sociological language or social science language one would call as a critical perspective, the word critical here implies that when we are talking about caste, like we talk about gender or race, these are bad things. These are things which are against the kind of broader perspectives or objectives that we have as humanity, not only in India but globally, post what one should say 19th century or post decolonization. The whole world is structured around nation states, and the nation states are supposed to be constitutional democracies, and the constitutional democracies are supposed to be constituted by individual citizens who are all equal, who are given rights, who are given justice as individuals. So I think that that's a major. You can say these are European, Western kind of perspectives, but that's what we have. And I personally, somebody as citizen of India, I think constitutional democracy is what kind of should govern us. But it's not as simple as that. So when we think about question of caste as it has unfolded during the post-Ambedkar period in last, say, 70, 75 years, I think there are, broadly speaking, two different perspectives which are at some level implicit but are not stated so clearly. And very often they seem to be the same perspective, but I think they're also different. One is the perspective of annihilation. I think that's something which Ambedkar started with, that caste is something that has to be annihilated, that we have to overcome caste. Caste has to be, in some sense, destroyed. But the way in which Dalit politics or caste question has evolved over the past 75 years, it has largely been through the language of identity. Now, identities are very critical. Identities, at some level, also open up questions which we take for granted. Like, for example, feminist movement also talked about identity, that, entire social science, entire civic discourse is being talked about for everyone, but it is about the man. It's not only the man is written as man, it also excludes women, and women have differences. When you need to highlight inequalities, identity becomes a way of saying it, way of articulating it. And I think India has also been caste blind, because most of the people who are in positions of power, or what one would call as the Indian establishment, till today largely remains a kind of privileged caste establishment. I don't like using the word upper and lower. So there is this marginalized categories and privileged castes, and you know what privileged castes are. And those privileged castes continue to be both in position of power politically, but also socially and economically. I mean, you talk about Dalit millionaires, but there are very few Dalit billionaires, if there is any. And that's not simply an accident, that's a whole structural process. So, but the question of, if we are talking about annihilation, that can be translated very differently, and where we have to try to achieve a point where we become as each other's equal as individuals. But when we are talking about identities, it takes us to what Kashiram had described as hissedari. Now, hissedari can be a very interesting and important political move, but it can also create other problems. The point that Professor Pai was talking about, that we talk about representational politics through hissedari, but hissedari could be a kind of collective identity of Dalits or individual identity of Jatis. Whose hissedari is one talking about? Who is going to represent whom? If it is going to be a collective identity, even in case of feminist movement, this question of representation comes up very centrally in the West around question of race. Who is going to represent the black woman? So is women an all-encompassing identity, or there are other identities as well? You talk about intersectionality or whatever. But in case of caste also, every region has, we know, scheduled caste is not a singular category. It's a constitutional construct, legal construct. Dalit is a political construct, but in everyday life, what we have are jatis, and every state has a list of jatis. Punjab has 39, Haryana has 38, UP has many more, perhaps some states have lesser. But all these are concrete kinship groupings. If you ask anyone, if you look at politics today in Haryana, they would not talk about Dalit as such. They would talk about Dalit also, but within that, who represents whom? If there is person A represents a particular jati of Dalits who may be very substantial in number, but they do not cover entire Dalit population. And that's how Hindu right wing was very successful in attracting a large sections of Dalit population by using the same logic of hissedari. So hissedari can be a kind of double-edged weapon. It can unite, but it can also divide. But more importantly, it also can work against the idea of citizenship because it can also strengthen kinship-based communities. And kinship-based communities can also be extremely patriarchal, extremely inward-looking, and at some level working against the very logic of constitutional democracy or citizenship. I'm talking about extreme cases. So this whole question of collective community identities, mobilized identities, unities also has other problems. So therefore, I think we should also remember the other side of struggle against caste, which Ambedkar had started, and that is of questions of annihilation. And how does one work with this? In India, state has been a very important political process. When we talk about state and democracy, these are not simply institutions. People looked up to state as an institution which would bring about transformation. India needed change, and that's why the Ambedkar statement become very critical, and that's why political parties are very touchy about constitution, and constitution itself becomes a very important political kind of symbol for mobilizing marginalized sections of the society. So the state in India is not simply an oppressive institution. State in India is also an institution which at some level has the responsibility of transforming society and delivering justice. So one tends to have a negative view of the state, but if you look at the constitutional, historical, political history of India, state has a very positive role to play. That's why we are so obsessed with democratic politics. That's because our society needs major changes. So democracy, democratic political process should be seen as a creative, agential process of change through which human actors can mobilize themselves and occupy those positions of power which can be very effective. And this is how it works on ground. This is why politics is so critical. So I think state has been working in two different ways. State has been working from above to bring about change through reservations, but state processes have also been working from below. The whole process of mobilization, elections, these are not processes from above. When we're talking about Dalit politics, creating an opinion where state has to respond. That's why politicians are very scared of numbers, and those numbers which mobilize themselves become even more difficult. I'll just take another 2-3 minutes and try to kind of wind up my final points. Indian establishment, as I was talking about earlier, has mostly been caste blind, and it is happy to be caste blind. And the point that Mr. Pai was making about merit and the whole language of merit, how it is in some sense produced, articulated, and used as a hegemonic narrative, where we should talk about progress by blinding ourselves towards caste. And I think that has been at some level the mainstream narrative, and that has become even more powerful post 1990s with liberalization, with other kinds of post-national processes, as some people would call it, where that we have to kind of compete in the global market, and everyone has to work hard, etc., etc. You have to make yourself. If you're a competent, smart enough person, you can also become a millionaire. And if you're a Dalit millionaire, you are not going to ask for jobs. You are going to provide jobs. All those narratives became very popular, and they were very tempting across Dalit groups as well. You have this new kind of Dalit articulation happening from within Dalit communities. These were kind of very scary, in some sense, developments where the question of caste was being completely ignored, and it was actually producing a new narrative of caste blindness, where merit was being talked about as source of mobility for everyone, including the Dalits. Now, my final point is why this judgment? Why am I talking about this when we are talking about judgment? There has been, I think most people have read the judgment, those who have written on it, but I think there has been a kind of quick response to it. And the quick response is obviously a response which in some sense looks at the negative side of it, and that negative side is because we have very little trust in our state system. We say that state is transformative, policies coming from there, but at the same time, we don't trust our state system and its institution, whether it is judiciary or it is executive or the decision makers themselves. Overall, even those who vote for particular political parties, they don't trust their leaders, and there is reason for that. So there is suspicion that the moment you have a new judgment, you tend to kind of look at it as a threat to whatever already exists. And what exists has also been achieved with a lot of struggle, and it's very little. As Professor Pai was talking about, there are reservation positions, but they are not being filled. If they are not being filled, and if you also subclassify, it is going to create even more problem. But I see possibilities. I'm not saying that necessarily it would lead to good effect, but I see there is a possibility where it would take us to the direction of making caste as a real policy issue. Even though caste became a policy issue in India before independence and then reservation, but if you look at the Indian mainstream development narratives, they have been largely caste blind. If you look at planning for development until 1990s or early 2010s, it was Professor Thorat's push that caste becomes a policy issue. Before that, it wasn't really being talked about at all in poverty discussions, in inequality discussions. It was only household and income, not really talking about question of caste. So I think this judgment perhaps has its own unique, interesting, positive side to it. But in order to get that positive side highlighted, we will have to engage with it. Now, there is not one single judgment, as was being talked about. There are 6 different judgments. So if you look at the entire spectrum of judgments, there are some judges who are talking about creamy layer, which is very scary phenomenon. You can't really talk about creamy layer among Dalits as you talk about among OBCs, because how do you quantify something like prejudice and discrimination? How do you say that this person, because he is or she is an IAS officer, there is no prejudice against her? That is empirically not true, that they continue to carry that prejudice. So creamy layer argument needs to be completely contested, but at the same time, there are many other things that this judgment is doing. This judgment is not a policy narrative. This judgment is not giving a direction for framing policy. This judgment is only saying that if there is a demand from below, if there is a data, if there is case that can be made in favor of subclassification, it should be allowed. It's not saying that it has to be done. It is not like land reforms that directive went from the government of India. Every state has to introduce land reforms. It is not saying that. Even if you do that, so I think it does 2-3 things. One is that it opens up caste question and it makes it mainstream. And second, see, unfortunately, we have this colonial language and we continue to use it. Question of backwardness. What do we mean by backwardness? I remember I used this word in double quotes for a paper which was published, which has just come back for revisions, and they said, please explain this for non-Indian audience. If we use this word backwardness, people would object to it in mainstream language. Backward is a bad word. Backward is not a desirable word. So at some level, I think the narrative of reservation has to move away from the discourse of colonial discourse of backwardness to a discourse of discrimination and prejudice. And this judgment gives us that language. This makes a case that reservation is required not because there are certain communities which are backward. Nobody is backward. Nobody has ever been backward, right? This whole idea of backwardness is very, very problematic. It's a colonial idea. So we need to abandon this, even if we use it only as a kind of descriptive category. So backwardness is judgmental category as well. So I think the narrative has to move from the idea of backwardness to the idea of prejudice and discrimination. Another thing that it does, which is even more important, that these are empirical processes, right? It doesn't talk about a fossilized idea of caste. Caste is a living reality. Yesterday caste was different. Today's caste is different. The way caste is experienced, the way caste is lived, you talk to your parents, wherever you are, whether you are so-called privileged caste or marginalized category or most marginalized, everyone's caste and the manner in which it is lived, the manner in which it is articulated, the manner in which it is talked about, the manner in which it is acted upon has changed. Now everyone in India is mobile in one way or the other. So we experience caste much more. Today, caste narrative is much bigger than it used to be when people like Sudhapai and myself were students in 1970s and 60s. So there was hardly any talk about caste. JNU did not talk about caste until 10, 15 years back. There was hardly any seminar on caste. Occasionally, in sociology department or in political science department, there would be some discussion on caste. But otherwise, in terms of discussions like this, very little was being talked about. So I think the life of caste has changed. And I think this judgment, I personally feel that the Dalit activists, those who are advocates of quotas and fighting for quotas, and people, all of us like those who are looking at this question, should use this as a starting point and argue for a lot of policy engagement with caste. And I think every state needs to have a caste commission. We need to have data on caste at every level. Caste is not a national phenomenon. In practice, caste is a local institution. Every region has its own structures of caste hierarchy, its own structures of privilege and marginalizations, and its own grammar of caste. It varies significantly. Deprivations have also changed. Urban deprivations are very different from rural deprivations. Urban deprivations in some contexts are very different from other contexts. Those who have experienced mobilities, we were talking about the so-called Dalit elite. Is there a Dalit elite? We need to look at their own empirical processes, and those empirical processes will have to be articulated beyond economics. So what we need is a kind of differentiated view of quotas which should be grounded on data. And I think it would be very useful if it is done through a participatory process so that trust can be restored. And it is for the state, this comment is for the state, that state needs to involve everyone, those who have stakes in reservation particularly, and sub-classification demand does not come from above. Sub-classification demand came from below. Punjab, still one can say that it was Zail Singh who implemented it because he wanted to divide Dalit vote into Akalis and Congress. But when it comes to South India, it comes to Andhra Pradesh, it came from below, from a Kamma community. It wasn't suggested by any bureaucrat or any politician. Yes, now politicians will use for division. That's what we should not allow, but that does not mean that reservation policy should be fixed for all the times to come. It should not become an identity question, it should become a question of citizenship. Thank you very much.